Have you ever watched a disaster movie where, because you know it's a disaster movie and you even know the nature of the disaster that's about to play out, you watch all of the steps in the first half of a movie, marvelling at how clueless the characters are about the inevitable steps that they're taking towards disaster? I keep having that feeling in real life every time I tune in to American politics. I mean, maybe America isn't going to push itself stupidly into a civil war, or at least a breakdown of norms leading to civil conflict of some sort. But the script sure seems to have been written that way. Every step of the path that we see unfolding before our eyes is playing to my worst case scenarios, step after relentless step. Former President Trump was at a moment just 6 months ago when he seemed to be losing authority, so sure, why not re-energise him by threatening to throw him in jail? This week we saw yet another indictment against him, this one theoretically focused on the most serious charges of all, and it could land him in jail effectively for the rest of his life. But it's complicated. So of course, the one of the 3 indictments brought against him so far that has the best actual legal case, the one about secret documents, that one will be heard in Florida, with a reportedly Trump-supporting judge, good chance of a sympathetic Florida jury. Quite likely, therefore, that one will come to nothing. Now, if that turns out to be otherwise, he would at least be convicted on something that he definitely did do. I mean, one would be able to complain about the inconsistent application of the law, since Hillary Clinton did much the same thing and was not prosecuted because it would not be in the public interest, but the case would at least be sound. However, the one brought this week, the one that focuses on some of the biggest constitutional questions, that one seems to have some pretty dodgy legal arguments from the position of actually proving the commitment of a crime. But it will be heard by a jury in DC, where Trump is universally reviled, and by a judge who may turn out to be impartial, but if not, definitely leans to Trump skepticism by all accounts. I don't think one should jump to hasty presumptions about bias. Some judges must be professional enough to apply the law regardless of their personal feelings, but plenty will jump to such conclusions, and it's kind of rather built into the scenario. The reckoning is that such a jury would find Trump guilty of pretty much whatever was put in front of them. And the anti-Trumpers are delirious with the possibility of it. This is, after all, the scenario they've been dreaming of, and they can't at the moment see beyond the vision they most desperately want in front of them, Trump in a jail cell. And that leads them simply not to notice how badly this is likely to play out. They keep talking about how unprecedented it is that a president has now been indicted for actions that he took while still in office. Yes, indeed, unprecedented. But you see that as an indicator of how bad the man is, which happens to be what you thought from day one. People on the other side see it as unprecedented because they see you breaking norms of behaviour, using the criminal justice system to pursue and harass your political opponent, the one who happens to be the front runner to stand in the next election, by the way. Yes, they say America is cosplaying being a banana republic. So, congratulations. You have someone whose failings as a campaigner you might have benefited by, and you're instead removing from him the power to dig his own political grave. You're making him instead into a martyr. Fantastic. So suppose you're successful, and you get that moment you're desperately praying for. Trump goes to jail, partying in the street, I expect. But the election campaign is still running. You hope that in prison he will be unable to effectively campaign. You hope that even if his base will be motivated, the middle ground of voters simply won't vote for someone who's in prison, because you can't conceive that they might interpret the situation differently to you. And you hope for all that while putting up a weak candidate, clearly too old for the job, around whom some credible legal questions are also hanging, courtesy of his wayward son, as reflected by a recent CNN poll that put Biden and Trump, right now, with all the indictments in the air, put them on equal pegging in terms of voting intention for the next election. And remember, historically, polls have often underestimated Trump's support when it came to the actual vote. So let's suppose you're wrong, because, you might be. Either Trump is then able to go back to the White House because he gets re-elected, probably able to pardon himself, and at that point, you don't only have Trump in the White House, you have a deeply vengeful Trump in the White House, probably surrounded by people selected to match his mood, rather than the collection of relative restraining hands he had the last time, who could talk him out of his most madcap inclinations. The process you conducted may well have served to turn him into the man you feared he would be the first time round, ironically. Your side, the ones who wept in the street when he won in 2016, and especially the ones who rioted in the streets at various times, how are they going to respond in that scenario? And come to that, how will you respond, the so-called grown-ups in the room? Will you accept the peaceful transfer of power in that situation? Or will you follow the line I've already seen some rehearsing already, that the defence of the Constitution, of democracy itself, requires extraordinary steps in the face of extreme danger? Which is, of course, the door to civil war. That you must undermine democracy just this one time in order to save democracy. Of course, attempts will be made to prevent that, to find legal reasons why Trump can't just pardon himself. But let's face it, any such measures are going to end up at the Supreme Court. The one that had 3 Trump-appointed judges added to it. So then, most likely, the Supreme Court rules in his favour, and then one political half of the country rebels outright against that key institution of a nation, which also doesn't help. But suppose you were successful. You found a legal route to nullify his victory on account of being in prison at the time of the election. Do you not see that that single act would have destroyed the system that you claim to be defending? You might hear that and conclude, well, it's all okay, so long as Trump doesn't win the election. All right, here's the alternative scenario. Again, happens to be a worst case scenario. You succeed in locking Trump up. You celebrate right in the faces of the people on the other side, not much caring about that because you despise them anyway. This winds them up, as you would expect, and for a while you blatantly enjoy that fact. Then, nightmare scenario, remember, the election result comes and it is close. But close as it is, it gets called for Biden. Immediately you have a Trump base who were hinging their hopes of their man being freed by winning the election. Now they're facing the prospect not just that he lost the election, but of him being kept incarcerated, effectively for life, in their view as a gross political misjustice, and they will readily persuade themselves, whether there's evidence or not, that the election was fixed. But you know what? Here's the thing. Arguably, even in the absence of actual evidence of voter fraud, for multiple legal cases apparently brought for political purposes, kind of does equate to a fixed election. So again, consider those on the receiving end. These people who have been celebrating in their face have stolen their martyr from them under wholly false pretences. I doubt that vengeful Trump sitting in his prison cell is going to do much to dissuade them from that conclusion, you potentially see the disintegration in faith in the electoral process that scenario brings. How does that play out from that point? Probably not well. You might ask, well, look, those are worst case scenarios. Is there a good scenario here? Maybe, but every step that gets taken in real life in line with the bad movie we're all watching seems to go further and further away from it. Now, does that mean it all blows up then and there? Am I saying civil war by January 2025? I do not make predictions that specific. I mean, look, it's possible, but it's less likely. More that this becomes a major step en route that creates the conditions leading to the next major deterioration on its way to that outcome a few years down the line. An acceleration of the downward spiral, maybe the last point where that could have been avoided. And look, there are many things in the latest indictment where you could say, yes, there is evidence of Trump having behaved badly. It's not news, is it? I mean, many Republicans, including those now lining up behind Trump, were saying as much at the time when he was doing those things. But there is a difference between a person doing genuinely bad things and a person doing criminal things. And the difference is important. The latest indictment hinges on whether Trump knew that he had lost the election fair and square, and that therefore he took actions in challenging the result that were corrupt and unlawful. Really, how are you going to prove that? Having read a couple of the numerous books written by people who either were present or who interviewed a bunch of people who were present, I took it as self-evident that this hugely egotistical, self-deluded man absolutely believed that there was no way he could have lost fair and square. A perception very much heightened by the fact that the early results had him performing very strongly, leading him to conclude that he'd won, and then the later counting of mail-in ballots pulled that away from him, leading him to believe that what he'd already come to accept as his was being stolen from him. Highly predictable human psychology, and indeed something that was actually predicted as one of my worst case scenarios for 2020. Oh, but various people around him told him he'd lost, the indictment argues. Well, so what? You're telling me that people with a strong ego and a fixed view are incapable of hearing contrary opinions to their own without rejecting them. In counter evidence, Your Honour, I present the internet. The prosecution, of course, have a couple of testimonies that they put forward to make their case. For instance, that he said, "You're too honest," at one point to Mike Pence, for example. But there are many more quotes from people who, at the time, believed that he had total self-belief on the subject, even as they personally believed he was completely deluded. No doubt they will be brought up by the defence, assuming that his defence lawyers are competent this time, which you can never take for granted when it comes to Trump. Now look, this has nothing to do now with how you feel about the man. You can hate him and be convinced that he must have done something somewhere that would fairly get him locked up. It may be true, but you know, evidence. Or you can absolutely love him, take him as your political North Star. None of that affects the principle at stake here and the huge damage being done to the American system as a result of how this is progressing. This latest indictment crosses a line. In the end, it is not illegal to try out numerous legal theories, however wacky some of them may be, to support your case. Those things and more, I remember, were done by both sides in the contested election result of Al Gore versus George W. Bush. All Trump's legal challenges got thrown out in pretty robust fashion. It is not illegal to then call on people to protest. Now, it would be illegal to call on them to riot. And the indictment sort of implies that that's what happens. It says this specifically: finally, after exhorting that we fight like hell, and if you don't fight like hell, you're not going to have a country anymore. The defendant directed the people in front of him to head to the Capitol, suggested he was going with them, and told them to give members of Congress the kind of pride and boldness that they need to take back our country. Having held up a standard of honesty that Trump failed to meet, the indictment equally fails its own standard by omitting from that telling two key words that Trump did use in that speech, which were peacefully and patriotically. That shows a speech that was advocacy, protected by free speech, rather than incitement to riot. The point is this: why does Trump remain popular, even gain in popularity, to the anguished puzzlement of his opponents? Largely because a significant number of Americans have been in revolt against what they see is an entrenched elite that despises them and that has control over most of the levers of power. That was the sentiment that Trump first tapped into in 2015-2016. Someone had to drain the swamp, he said. And the more they see that very elite organising what appears to be a genuinely political persecution of their main opponent, the more it reinforces that simplistic but not wholly incorrect worldview. Everyone is equal under the law, it gets argued, except discretion was shown in the decision not to prosecute Hillary Clinton. And while it's not all going the Biden's way, the process over Hunter Biden certainly doesn't look like anything like the process being taken over Donald Trump. So, is everyone equal under the law then? Really? This indictment suggests not. And so the Biden administration has handed an enormous gift to the other side. De facto evidence that whatever the ifs and buts and the justifications and the false moral equivalencies, the system is indeed rigged. No one is above the law should be a cast iron principle that keeps trust in the institution because it's seen in practice every day, every single time. But as trust in the institution fails, it has become a partisan slogan the same as all the others. And that is why America risks civil war. Not because there's political dysfunction. The American political system has had elements of that almost from the beginning of its history. But because the current dysfunction is destroying the basic foundations without which the system itself cannot stand. If you no longer have due process, impartial justice and the law, and well-managed democratic choice, then you default to the fight between raw political power. It's no coincidence, I would suggest, that this week also saw Fitch, one of the three major agencies that assesses creditworthiness, cut the rating of the United States from the top level of AAA to AA+. The continued rise of the US debt ceiling, now up to $31 trillion, plus this, the steady deterioration in the country's quality of governance, means that it's now riskier, still not considered highly risky, but riskier than it was before to own American debt. Frankly, with no apparent plan on any side for reducing the debt mountain and no apparent appetite on any side to begin to prioritise competence over ideology in the selection of leadership, this is likely to be just the beginning. Just the beginning of the process of sliding international confidence that could sharply accelerate depending on the events to come. Now, for the avoidance of doubt, one thing I need to say. There are people who seem to believe that commentators like me only ever predict things that we actually want to see happen. That somehow, if you believe the things that I've been putting forward, that must make you somehow against America, anti-American. Nothing could be farther from the truth. At a time of rising authoritarianism in the form of would-be world power China, this is not the time where any of us benefit in the slightest by America turning against itself and enfeebling itself on the world stage in this way. Seriously, just nominate presidential candidates who can walk in a straight line and talk in complete sentences. And don't jail your political opponents. That's all I ask. Because right now, the consequences of where you're going are all too evident to those of us watching this horror movie that you happen to be a part of.